Just go away.
Thank you, Mary. So you should have been hearing from Andrew Baubank today. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here, and I am honoured and humbled to be presenting in his place, and also to be sharing this stage with such incredible speakers that we've seen over the last few days. And please excuse my notes, just pretend they're not here. So as the program manager for Future Ready, I have this really unique role that I get to work with our teams and with projects all over Canada. Future Ready is a program, or more so a mindset, that helps our 8,500 staff in Canada and 46,000 around the world to see the future more clearly and design for it today. And from what I've seen in the last 2 days, that's really a mindset that all of us in this room share. Firstly, I'd like to thank Evergreen and Future Cities Canada for giving us the opportunity to hear from such diverse voices, such diverse experience, and such wonderful speakers in the last couple of days. WSP were delighted to be offered the opportunity to be one of the 4 lead sponsors, and we can't wait to come back to this event next year. But more so, I'd like to thank all of you in this room. All of you are enablers for our future. Enablers of diverse and strong communities, enablers of others to have a voice where they wouldn't usually have the opportunity to, and enablers of innovation through collaboration, co-creation, and through the communities that you build with your work. In my role, I talk a lot about trends, future trends specifically, so that we can move from reactive to proactive in the way that we respond to change and respond to future trends. And this really relies on our ability to identify the signals and indicators of impending change. And I challenge you to think about what those might be for your work and for your community. I want to pick up on a few of the trends that I think are really transforming Canada's future. And first, which has been a really strong theme throughout the last 2 days, are people. People are the reason that we all have jobs. They're why we come to work every day, to create change for our future population. Canada's population will grow to around 60 million by 2060, but it's not as easy as just growth. This growth will be driven by immigration and by growth of First Nations communities. We must enable these people to support and input to our economy and have connection to the opportunities that they deserve. Secondly, Canada's changing climate is potentially a threat to the wonderful and abundant natural resources that we have here. Melting permafrost is disconnecting remote communities. Rising temperatures and increase in lightning storms is increasing the frequency and intensity of our forest fires. And water resource management is being challenged by a changing water balance. The next, and what probably the most confusing, is technology. If I told you all 20 years ago that you'd be using an app to navigate your way around a conference, I'm still amazed that that exists. It's incredible. That you'd be watching a high-definition screen and that you would be getting an Uber to go home this evening, none of you would have believed that was possible. So when we start thinking 20 years into the future, to what technologies might be available then and to the opportunities that might present to us, it's a real challenge to start to design for that. But it is one that we can start to respond to today simply by designing flexibility into our projects and solutions. And finally, I want to think about urban resources, and particularly our aging infrastructure. This is often a frustration for those of you that get stuck in traffic on your commute every day, but it is also an opportunity and should be considered a valuable resource. It presents us the opportunity to rejuvenate urban spaces, to be lower carbon, sustainable places that are productive and healthy and give back to the communities. Municipal leadership, as we've seen throughout this conference, is incredibly strong in Canada and is really leading the way in the global stage in driving a sustainable future for our cities and for our communities. And it's this collaborative approach that puts Canada, that makes Canada known for positive change. Finally, I think the challenges we face and the opportunities that are arising as we look to the future can only be addressed with collaborative innovation and the strong networks that we all have right at our fingertips and that we have seen come together at this event. WSP has 28,000 active projects at any one time in Canada. We aim to design and deliver projects that support Canada's future. And if we add that to the tens of thousands of projects that all of you in this room are working on, just imagine the scale of impact that we all have every day on shaping Canada's future. I've been delighted to attend this conference, and I hope you've all had a great time. I'm going to hand back to Mary now to introduce the final session, and please enjoy.
Thank you. Shake your hand because I'm pricking my mic on. Thank you. Okay, could I ask please the panelists for the last session to come up, and I'm going to introduce them as they walk up here. Would you like to play? Because I don't want to deprive you. Play while they come up. Go, play. It's all yours. Come, come. Can you do a little jig? I need Tanya. Wherever you'd like, Senator. Sure, in the center. Where is Tanya? Keep playing because I have one more. Keep going. That's fine. There we go. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming up here. You've got the toughest shift of the 2 days. Aren't you glad we asked you to come? It's always hard to finish things off. I'm sitting on this other mic, which I'll turn off. So, joining us here are, as you can see, Tanya Talaga, who's an author and a journalist and just nailed it with the Massey lecture. Fantastic. Ratna Omidvar, who's a senator and who's been active on issues around citizenship and rights and knows a lot about cities. And she is here with us from the Senate of Canada. Rashiq Fataar, who's from South Africa, from Cape Town, and who runs this fabulous thing called Future, well, it's called something else. It used to be called Future Cape Town, but she'll tell me what it's called now. This is Rashiq. And then next to him, Maxim Bragoli, who works and founded Pepiniere in Montreal and who does all sorts of interesting interventions. You're going to hear about it. So, do you ever notice in meetings how this happens? If you're in a big meeting with 40 people or 20 people and the women all sit together. It just happens. I don't know how this happens, but here we are. The women are here, the guys are over there. We've had an interesting couple of days. Maxim and Rashiq have been here for the whole thing, and I think you guys just arrived today. Part of why we asked you to come is because we wanted to have a kind of opportunity for everybody to contribute with you to get your perspective on where you think cities are going in Canada, and to see if we can draw some threads about what we've been hearing. Because we've been hearing a lot about the physical nature of the city and technology and all the different ways in which we stitch ourselves together. But we've also been hearing all sorts of questions about where are people in that equation? And you just heard a conversation about jurisdiction, but you also heard people reiterating what they've heard here over the last 24 hours about power. So I'm going to start really by just going out to each of you and asking you to give us your best shot. If you had to pick, one thing that is on your mind about that cities need to be addressing, or we who live in cities should be addressing, what would it be? Just one thought to get us started, and let's go to you, Maxim. Quick.
I would go for alternative financing for community initiatives.
Yeah, I'm noticing it's difficult for us on the panel to hear each other. Go figure. So, just try it again, maybe a little more slowly.
Through the mic, or?
Yeah, maybe we'll do it that way. You tell the group and then you turn to us.
So how do we get to...
Hold the mic further away.
How do we get to fund community initiatives, alternative modes of financing.
Okay, we're going to do our best, Ratna. I hope you can get it. Tanya, one thing.
I have a lot to say.
And a mic that's not working.
It's not working.
Yeah, hang
I
on.
can yell.
No, hang on. Just have to turn it on. There you go.
Thank you very much for that. Can you hear me now?
Hang on, but the one I sat on was working, so. No, it's okay. Here, this one. Try that one.
Hello.
All righty, we got
Here we
that
go. Thanks very much for having me. I think I'm going to have a very different perspective from a lot of people in this room. I am going to say that when I think about cities, I think about communities, and I think about human rights and the lack of rights of Indigenous people in communities in this country.
Right. Okay. Rashiq. Turn it on. Oh, well.
Hello?
That's right. Go.
I think the big thing would be about taking these ambitions and discussions into tangible projects, be it incremental. We often speak about quality of life of people, but we never take these big infrastructure projects and measure the outcomes to say, this black population living here in Cape Town, for example, 500,000 people, will in the next 5 years get to work 25 minutes faster. We can spend money, we can prepare budgets, we can make plans, but outcomes for quality of life
Right.
in some ways just remain the same.
Right. So again, this relationship between projects and people. Senator.
It's really hard for a politician now to just give you one idea. So, you know, once
Oh,
you
give
get
it a
the
go. Give it a
I'm
try.
going to give you a few important ones, and we can discuss that later. I think on the issue of arrangements with the federal government and the provincial government, I think it's really important not to get caught up in the struggle for power and who's at the table and who's left out of the table, but to simply open the tiny chinks that are available to be stretched open. And I can give you examples of that later on in the conversation. I would also say, in line with what Tanya has said, is cities are where people express their citizenship. It's not an accident that the word citizenship derives from the word city. And yet, we have pockets of exclusion in this city and in other cities where people are residents, they are not citizens. And it is up to the city, I think, and up to us citizens to make this a far more inclusive society than it is.
Right. So let me just follow up with that and go with you on this. And I appreciate you talking about city. Can you hear us fair enough? Yeah? Okay. I appreciate you identifying that city and citizenship are the same root. I don't know whether everyone realizes that. And we know anecdotally that people their experience of where they live informs their concept of citizenship, right? So let's talk a little bit about those pockets of exclusion. And in your view, in the Senate, in the chamber, are there particular ways that we can, do we have wiggle room? Do we have ways that cities can intervene and do the kinds of tangible things that I think you're hinting at?
Well, I think a couple of things have happened in our political landscape in the last few months. One is with the surge of asylum seekers across Roxham Road in Quebec, and their arrival in places like Toronto and Montreal, and the breakdown of negotiations with the newly elected Premier of Ontario. Guess who the federal government sat down with? It sat down with the mayor of the city. Guess who the federal government wrote a direct check to? The city of Toronto, and did not have to go.
So there was
to the province of Ontario.
So there was no constitutional impediment to doing that.
No, and I think that's a really interesting, somewhat accidental outcome. We've got another example.
Okay.
With the carbon tax now being so heavily contested in this country by certain provinces, I believe the Minister of Environment, she stressed yesterday, said she will negotiate directly with institutions, hospitals, schools, and provide them with the support without going over the provincial arrangements. So I think a certain kind of chaos is good, because it leads us to finding new ways of finalizing or completing arrangements that are necessary.
Well, I think Mayor Redfern, somebody may have tweeted this, said something about flexible governance, that we need flexible approaches, and you're suggesting that there are ways to do it. Okay, well then I want to pass to Tanya, who's saying, look, I'm concerned about rights. How flexible do you think we should be about this? What happens if one city is showing a particular approach and another city is not?
Okay, so when I answer this, and I think in a number of different ways, it's really interesting for me to be here talking about cities and how to build cities, and I have a different perspective of cities, I think. I live here in Toronto. Toronto, when I look at the city, I don't see a very Indigenous city, yet there have been Indigenous people, First Nations people living in this city for at least 10,000 years.
Right.
And yet, where is the imprint from First Nations people? And yes, in Edmonton there's an imprint, and yes, there in Thunder Bay there's an imprint, but I'm also going to pick up a little bit on what Desmond Cole said yesterday about segregation, because that happens in this city. There's segregation. People live in certain areas. You know, he was talking specifically about Black people living in York, in northwest Toronto, and also in Scarborough. And also the difficulties of trying to rent a place to live. Sometimes if landlords don't like the color of your skin. I can talk to you about another city, because I think cities come in all different shapes and sizes, and a city named Thunder Bay in northern Ontario. It's a city of about 120,000 people. I know lots of people there have problems sometimes renting a place to live, just looking for basic housing. So sometimes, you know, when you guys are all talking here about how to build inclusive, wonderful cities, I'm talking about just finding a place to live, having a roof over your head. And I'm also talking about people that are coming from communities, and communities are also little cities too. And there are so many communities all through Ontario, they're called reserves. First Nations people live there. And those places as well often don't have adequate housing, they don't have water, proper sewage, all of these things that are used, all the infrastructure that you were just talking about earlier in the last panel too, sometimes it's not present.
Yeah.
We're still trying to build that.
Yeah.
Yet, people move too. They come into the cities to access services. So they come into the bigger cities, they come into Thunder Bay, they go to Winnipeg, they go to Edmonton, they go to Toronto looking for services. And when they come here, what do they see?
Yeah.
Where do they go?
Yeah.
Where is the inclusive city
Right.
for Indigenous people?
You know, we've heard over the last 2 days, I think others would agree with me, that housing has been a dominant message. Certainly the Deputy Mayor yesterday hammered away at it in New York. And I think there seems to be a couple of ways to look at this, including how Desmond raised it. Some of it is just plain old supply. Are we building units, and are we building the units we need? And there are a lot of people in this room that could actually have some influence over that. As Andrea Reimer said, the power is here, and there are a lot of people here who are involved in house building. So there's that piece, but then there's also the equity lens, because even if you do have the units, are we actually finding equitable ways to make sure that people have access to them, right? Which is kind of where I stitch back to Ratna. Do we need the federal government to continue to be that beacon of rights and entitlements that insists a city must? Should we have a right to housing, for instance? Ratna, what do you think?
So we do now have a federally legislated right to housing. I'm still not quite sure how it plays
How's it
out.
works? Yeah.
I think it's more aspirational than real, but I'm, for one, willing to wait for the picture to be painted before weighing in on it. But I would say that there is an age-old wisdom, I think, that the level of government furthest removed from the people has the greatest capacity to protect human rights. And the level of government closest to the people has the greatest capacity to deliver services to it. So I think we should examine that. Is that still true?
Well, but I wonder, are we seeing an inversion because, well, I don't know what we do about the provincial governments, but are we seeing an inversion in the US where a federal government said, we're out of the Paris Accord, and a bunch of cities said, oh, no, you don't. So could you imagine a time when a local community would become the better champion of the provision of rights?
We have loads of examples in cities across the world where citizens have stepped up and municipal government is far advanced from national limitations on rights. I'll give you an example. In our city, for years, our local police have a policy: do not ask about the status of women and children who ask for services. Because if they are undocumented, or if their stay permit has elapsed, that means you would have to report them to the RCMP. So the Toronto Police do something very wise. It's don't ask, don't tell. That policy has replicated itself in many other cities around the world. I can give you many more examples of how cities are actually fighters and enablers of human rights, where national governments are far more restrictive.
Well, let's go to your right, to Rashiq, who lives in Cape Town. Talk to us about that. You live in a place that is in the midst of this kind of rupture over the last couple of decades. Tell us.
I think there's a bit of irony in South Africa. Johannesburg and Cape Town have, alongside Bogota, the highest income inequality in the world. So sometimes in the past, when there were different political parties in different cities, they would say, well, we're the least unequal and you're the most, but they were all pretty much the most unequal. We have this sort of rapidly increasing property values, a very successful waterfront, successful inner city, and just to touch on what the Senator said, our federal policies only made provision for a public housing program for really poor houses to be built very far away, single dwelling matchboxes, and sort of lightly touched on what inclusionary from the private sector should be. So it was sort of, for 23 years of democracy, never required that any affordable housing development be in an area close to transport, close to schools, close to hospitals. And so the vagueness of national or federal policies has implications for the next 100 years of leaving out the middle income, the teachers, the policemen, the nurses who serve our cities, who simply wouldn't get a space in perhaps converted public buildings or in new developments happening. So I think it's this sort of federal to city relationship is quite key everywhere in the world. I speak to our rail service, which in Cape Town is currently falling apart because it's run by a national agency who doesn't have to deal with the people when trains are set on fire coming into our central station. It's the city who has to deal with that, who has limitations around simply providing bus rapid transit. So I think in some points, aspirational, vague federal policies can have real impacts in quality of life, where people feel it the most. And I think we need to sort of, at some points, of course, we want sort of collaborative governance, but I think it's a tough stance that cities need to take and to be tough. And yes, it's not a hierarchy. We heard some of the previous panelists say it needs to be sort of a spheres of government cooperation. But at some points, cities and mayors often have to draw the line around the rights of asylum seekers and migrants and refugees, because cities are the places where many of these challenges play out. And if I think of a rail commuter or a single mother looking for transitional housing who's being evicted, they're not saying, well, let me think about which level of government is the right one to go to.
No, of course not. They're just saying, give me a place to
actually, the
live.
rail agency runs, the national agency runs our rail. Oh, this is the city bus. I should talk to cities. So I think we need to, cities are often at the forefront of this fight, and mayors with their very limited budgets and revenue models, relying on electricity and property taxes, have to sort of do this really big fight. And I think citizens and people, young people, need to back them in that fight.
Right, I mean, Ratna, I saw you frowning. Do you want to respond? No, don't worry, I'll get to him, but do you want to respond to Rashiq?
Well, I don't know enough about the South African Constitution, but here in Canada, our Constitution guarantees the freedom of movement. There's no way a mayor in our country could say, I want you as a resident and not you. There's absolutely no way. The mayor of a city in Canada is obliged to provide services
But people,
to its residents.
but people do it. I mean, the mayor may not say it, but we know bus tickets are given to send people. I mean, it does happen, so.
It does happen, but I haven't heard a lot of that
Right.
happening in Canada, not in Canadian.
I mean, I guess it's this top-down, bottom-up blend. And I'm wondering if, do you want to respond too?
Actually, I do want to say something.
Yeah,
I
go.
want to say two things. You know, the Indian Act for so long kept people out of cities. They couldn't leave their communities at all. They would get in trouble and they would get imprisoned and they had to go back to their reserve. So actually, that did happen. And I think too, when I'm sitting here thinking about all the different levels of government that sits around and talks about cities and how to, you know, you're talking about the inverse and maybe cities should be taking more of a role. We've forgotten another group, and that is the First Nations themselves.
Sure.
They need to be at the table too.
Well,
you know?
and I didn't take up on us, and I should have when you raised it. So you and I chatted a bit before about have we become overly sentimental and allowed this to sort of become a token gesture around Indigenous as opposed to some more fundamental affirmation of Indigenous leadership in municipal communities? What would that look like?
Well, every city belongs on a First Nation,
Yeah.
in a First Nation community. How many people, when they're making city, and I don't cover City Hall, so I don't know how this works, but how many people invite, say, the Mississauga, the New Credit Chief, Stacey Laforme, into a city planning meeting so they can sit there and discuss
Right.
what they're going to be doing?
Right.
I'm going to guess, I don't know if that
Right.
happens a lot. You
Right.
know, I know that there are some overtures being made, and I encourage like everyone here, because you guys are all influencers and city builders, to sort of extend your hand and say, okay, you know, include others. Include the First People's perspective
Right.
too. And that's not tokenism if you actually extend your hand out and say, please come and let's
Right.
actually sit down and talk about this.
Can I leave you and go over to Maxime and come back to your other point? So, Maxime, you are engaged in the physical fabric of Montreal, and I know that you've had a number of outreaches to the Indigenous community who are engaged with that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, about how you've bridged that?
From the field perspective, we try to do our best to get an understanding of the community at large, but we kind of work with the actual elements. So we come from the architectural background. We don't have a specific consciousness of what we want to achieve, so we don't have an agenda, we don't have this direction of where we want to go. The simple idea is to be inclusive and be welcoming, the equivalent of having an invitation to our houses. So families, multi-generation, our scope of reach is infinite. I think Montreal has a language barrier also that is important for newcomers. There's this, people that don't speak French don't get a chance to really have a full professional or integration to the society in Quebec, which I think it's another component to selection of newcomers. But as we grow as a non-for-profit and we address those elements, we get to know a little bit more how can we talk to cities, how can we talk to government about these issues, and we kind of see that there's a stretch we can go. So there's a middle ground to find between government and citizen-led initiatives. And I want to get back to this notion of citizenship.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't relate to citizen because they're not. They're aspiring to it, but it's like an exclusivity we kind of realize like, it's inclusive, it's for citizen. And people are just like, yes, but me? What do you mean? Well, I'm not from here. I'm a newcomer. So there's a time frame of people adapting to the local community. So we welcome people. We don't no longer talk about citizenship. We talk more about people living close to the public space that we animate. And we really make sure that they get a chance to participate. We're all in this notion of participation. We invite people to take part of it. and showcase what they do. And as they present themselves as actors of the community, they kind of get this notion of proudness and where they're from, and they live again. They don't have to adapt to the Quebec structure of what
Right.
is a frame, and they can actually add their spices and their stories to our collective fabric.
You know, I lived in New Orleans for a number of years after Katrina, and the Built Forum in New Orleans has big, I don't know how many of you have been there, but it has these big sections, swaths of land along big roads that are empty, that are called the neutral ground. And they're called a neutral ground for the historic reason that that's where the different cultures in New Orleans actually met. So the physical city has this impact, but I think what we're wrestling with a little bit is the physical city, the aspiration of the city, the entitlements of the city, and how do we weave that web, right? To make it a promise. There is something called the Indigenous Placemaking Council, and there are efforts that are taking place where Indigenous communities are doing all sorts of placemaking, and the question is, how do we create more opportunities for the kind of overlap, right? Thoughts on that? Do you have thoughts, Rashiq? Have you an experience with it?
Well, what Maxim was saying just reminded me of a sort of one of our smaller projects, a creative installation we did, where traditionally public participation is in our country, it's some radio advertisement and it's sort of black and white, page 7 with no pictures of a very important public building or ask for comment. And we put a yellow box in a public space which I think cost about maybe 1,000 Canadian dollars, and it was sponsored by a company. And in one day we got 250 responses to a process which would get 3 responses from planning bodies. So I think it's Mary, it's that difference between will and legal requirements. And I think we need to sort of go a bit beyond that to say, do we want people's opinions? And in my particular context, somebody doesn't have 2 hours for a town hall meeting at 7 p.m. because it's 2 hours home on the bus or train, a second job, and the walk in their neighborhood to the town hall is pretty dangerous. You're not going to sort of assemble at send your kids and your parents down 10 blocks to a town hall. So I think it's, that yellow box, despite being such a small project, if you can just get 250 people's views per day by just asking them,
Right.
And giving them legitimacy that is not based on citizenship, I think you can grow leaps and bounds in terms of getting to grips with what people actually want and need. And the best comments are just people saying that they never knew that somebody wanted their opinion or wanted their point of view. We didn't ask them for their names, didn't have to sign a form. But I think that was the most important. If you want to ask, if you want the point of view, if you want participation, it's you have to go beyond legal requirements.
I mean, the thing about a lot of what you folks have been doing is that and a lot of what we've been talking about is concrete things, tangible things you can look at and that you can physically participate in. That's one of the good things about the city. There's a lot to do physically for us to engage. So I just want to come back to Tanya for a second. How much intention, maybe we can't fix some of the bigger things theoretically. Maybe we just have to get in the dirt with each other, and build some stuff,
That's absolutely true, and I'm just going to talk about what you said a little tiny bit, and you talked about the notion of citizens and the word cities, and it also means belonging,
Right.
feeling like you belong somewhere, and if the original inhabitants of this land don't feel like they belong, yeah, there are some things we can do, just even while we're all solving those bigger issues that are going to take, that are going to take generations to fix, things that we're talking about now that we're not going to see fixed in our generation. I think we could all agree on that. It's going to be our children's children that will probably benefit from a more inclusive Canada that has rights for everyone in mind. But in the short term, I think there are little things you can do to help with belonging. I'm going to tell you about a couple of things. Street signs. How come they can't be translated? So we have
Right.
English and then underneath them, just, have it in Ojibwe, have it in the language of the city that you're sitting on. That in itself is just a little piece of inclusiveness. And it's just a reminder to everyone else, too, that's driving around, and you may not speak Cree, or you may not speak whichever Indigenous language it is with that city, but just to see it is a reminder in your mind. And whoever is visiting in that city is a reminder, oh right, there are other people here before me. You know, we had a week here in Toronto. It was just a couple of weeks ago when we remembered residential school survivors. And it was the most beautiful thing that we had at City Hall. There were teepees set up at Nathan Phillips Square. And also, residential school survivors were welcomed, and they were asked, elders were asked to come, and they were celebrated in the middle of the square. And I remember I was speaking to somebody there that I ran into that I know, and he was saying, you know, this feels so good. It feels like this is the first time this has happened where we feel like we belong. And it was a beautiful thing to see, too, those teepees in the middle of Nathan Phillips Square.
I mean, there is something about we are where we've come from.
That's right, and
Right.
those are just little things, and also too that sense of belonging. You don't really get that sense of belonging too when you walk through a big park and see a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald.
No.
You know, that's
Some people might like it. I don't know who they are, but some people might.
right. So they're all
They're
these,
not
like,
here, but
these little things you can
Yeah,
do
yeah.
before you get to the bigger things, and extending your hand. And you know, one of the things I was thinking about too when I was driving here was, like, all of you, like I mentioned before, you guys are the change makers. You're the ones that sit here and think about the cities. And if you want to even make your urban cities more inclusive, getting to know those communities I was telling you about earlier, that's one way to do it. You know, reaching out and figuring out how can you help with housing. Don't wait for the federal government to do it. Don't wait for any other layer. Just like maybe there's some sort of philanthropic end that you guys could say, well, we can actually help maybe bring power to your community. A lot of communities in the north run on diesel still. Little things like that. And by reaching your hand out in that way, it's going to come back to you in a richer way, right?
So let me just talk to Maxim about this, because you're from the design community.
Yeah.
And you guys know how to make this stuff happen.
I think there's this notion of power and creating a space that allows people to express themselves is super important. We see the public space as a common good, but most of the time, who actually gets to fund the public space kind of get their saying of what is going to being said or what's going to happen. So there's kind of taboos, there's discussion that we don't want to address in the public space because it's everyone's space, and this discussion might hurt someone or might not be in that interest. So how can we get enough of regulation and permits to allow the public space to be that media for communities to express themselves? And on the other hand, how do we get some funds? But there's two ways of seeing it. Either we volunteer to go out and become the community that is activating a space, or we're looking for a business model to activate the space, to give some content. So everything is shifting to a normal, traditional eyeballs or how many visitors, like festival.
But you're making it possible. You're creating a space for people to step in and make something happen.
Yes, and also there's no interest of how many people who are attending. The metric of numbers is not a thing, but the content and the quality of that content is super important. But there's no way of funding this notion. So at the city level, we have a super opportunity to be addressing national issues.
Which you can do at the ground.
Yes,
Yeah,
on going outside, because if we're staying in our houses, there's no way we can communicate, and we get to meet our neighbors.
Which kind of circles back, I think, to the notion of citizenship, that if I'm living in a place like that, where I can contribute, where there's a place for me, where I have a place to live, my sense of citizenship in this country is very different than if I'm living in a place where there's no place to live, where nobody speaks to me, where I'm not engaging with other people, right?
And your citizenships comes with a vote, and the vote.
Yeah,
actually,
exactly.
It's like an ongoing
Yeah,
system.
yeah. Okay,
So how can you integrate a platform where it's welcoming for you? So there's mechanics that needs to be rethinked.
Everybody over 50 has to understand what you mean by platform. I'm getting it. This used to be a platform. There's other things. Okay, Ratna, go.
I want to weigh in on the two, and I think somewhat interlinked ideas around public space and belonging. Because public space is public, it belongs to all of us. But there are a number of trends that I think make it even more important. Let's just talk about the Greater Toronto Area. The evidence shows that there are higher numbers of ethnic enclaves, which are more dense today than the ethnic enclaves of the last 2 decades. And how do you, and these ethnic enclaves are not as porous as they used to be. So public space, your school, your library, your park, becomes all that more important. I was so terribly excited about the 3 new universities in places like Brampton, Markham, and Milton, and those would have been public spaces to have drawn out residents. And I believe, notwithstanding the decision of the current government in Queen's Park, there is enough interest in the citizenship in these places to actually build those universities as public spaces of learning and gathering. So those are new spaces, but we also have to reimagine public space and use it differently. You know, I love that community center in Toronto that uses its swimming pool every summer and turns it into a fishing center where kids from inner city come and they learn how to fish. Because guess what? Their moms
swim?
and dads don't have the time to take them fishing.
And
So,
then they swim in it?
I don't know about
This makes
that.
me
I'm sure
anxious.
it gets cleaned.
Anybody sending their kids to that
They
pool?
fish, and I think it's actually brilliant that you use existing infrastructure,
Sure.
use it differently for a different purpose,
Sure.
to further belonging.
So just as Tanya's suggesting, all we have to do is put old names on the street. There are these small ways that we can, as you say, adapt. Well, we're in one, which is a big piece of infrastructure that got adapted, and all these ways we could signify it. Yeah, Maxim and then Rashiq. Yeah.
There's this transition to enhance and a way to figure out. When we started La Pépinière, where we kind of realized that we kind of didn't had access to building the city. You see like the city has a specific role, and you kind of get a saying once in the public consultation of where the city is going. But there is an agile framework. There's a transitional, ephemeral way of designing collectively cities. It's not finished, but it's an evolution. It's less costly, and it's a narrative that grows with the community. So the city has specific equipment that serves specific objective. For example, the library or the pool, there's no space for collective initiatives to sprung and to be innovation. We need to figure out ways to have deep innovation, spaces that are not super productive, but in the long run, that will come with new ideas of how we co-design cities.
Right.
I think just 2 short points. The first just being on what Maxim and the Senator have been saying about having multiple functions in a space. Our universities can no longer be closed, elite, exclusive institutions. Our libraries, as the Deputy Mayor of New York yesterday said, can't just be about storing books, but should be about downloading movies and accessing resources. And I think, you know, maybe it's not a library anymore, just a community center or a public pool or a sports complex, but we redefine public space as being all the public buildings. Many of us who work in public space often say it's a space between buildings, but it includes buildings, it includes public buildings. Some of our biggest challenges in Cape Town are the public buildings not opening up. Our slave museum has closed windows. Our social history center has glass preventing the homeless from entering the pillars. So it's often not our private institutions, but our public ones which should be opened up. And then just to be a bit provocative on the second point, you know, some of you might know in South Africa, our biggest university, the University of Cape Town, students took down the statue, the Rhodes Must Fall statue. Cecil John Rhodes, who funded the university, they took it down. And I'm not suggesting, I never would suggest that taking down structures is the only way to promote belonging. I believe we need to change street names, place names. We need to see people. We need to see women and women heroes in spaces. Our apartheid struggle wasn't just by men. But I think what's surprising the most is that people were surprised that there are multiple tools to create belonging. Some of them are taking down. Some of them are putting up. Some of them are renaming.
Yeah.
And this concept of reconciliation, belonging, identity requires multiple tools,
Right.
and some of them are not very comfortable.
Okay, last comment for each of you. Tanya. Want something?
I think that I like where this conversation has come to an end too, about the concept of belonging and the concept of sort of changing around spaces, you know, and what you're just saying about libraries. Libraries, if you look at through the Indigenous storytelling lens, storytelling is oral. You know, libraries should be a spot of community meeting, of people getting together and talking about ideas. And while my suggestion of just changing street names or just adding the Indigenous name as well, or a translation, it seems small, but it means a lot. Because once you see it over and over and again, it becomes an issue of right. I remember that. It's something that's physical and that I see. I'm going to tell you a little tiny story, and then I'll be quiet.
That's fine.
There is, I remember how I was saying earlier that this land has been occupied for at least 8,000, 10,000 years by the Ojibwe. And I live in the east end of Toronto, and there has been evidence there found of a family that lived there. And this family was a Kashiguk family. And a little tiny road was just renamed in the beaches area, and it's just a squiggle of a road. It's like, it's almost like an alley. It links from one road, main road, to the next. And that is one of the very first things that I've seen that's changed. The name of that little squiggle street is now Kashigo Road, to remember the people that lived there 8,000 years ago, where I live, in this city.
Wow.
Meanwhile, a stone's throw away, about 150 feet, there is a house commemorating Sarah Ashbridge and her family. And they were wealthy landowners in that area. And most of the East End, there's Ashbridge's Bay, there's Ashbridge's this and that. And they lived there 250 years ago. And the house has been kept, and it's beautiful. There's a big garden around it, and we're celebrating all the names and everything else. Talk about belonging.
But somehow they can hold each other.
Right. We're just starting though, right? We've just started the
We're just
squiggle.
starting.
It was there. You know,
just
think of the
starting.
Roman Colosseum. Things are celebrated in cities from people from a long time ago.
Right.
We got a squiggle.
Yeah.
You know, when
Yeah,
the
well,
nurses
yeah,
pretty
well,
close.
yeah,
So
yeah.
little things mean a lot.
Yeah, right.
When we get to the bigger things,
Let's-
which will come.
I hear you. Little things mean a lot. Maxim. Last comment.
I think we're in a period of disruptive everything, and it's a great opportunity to establish new norms. The sense of belonging is really key to our relationship to each other. There's new ways of co-designing and collectively achieve something. There's either way, either we go in a survival mode, or we kind of collectively go to an aspiration towards a better world. We are cities, we are individuals, and we live. So it's our home, it's our dwelling, it's our spaces. And there's something that is, for the future, very exciting. And I think participation and the way we can express and saying, this is not my turf. It's where we live. And
Shared.
Share, yeah. Share would be my last
Okay,
thought.
Rashiq and Ratna, just quick comments from each of you to wrap us up.
I would just want to say, you know, if I come back to Toronto again, I'd love to see 10 to 15 massive billboards in your downtown that showcase women and men who've changed the city over, as we heard earlier, you know, 14,000 years. And I think that that's the first point. It's perhaps just public art that's visual, that reminds people that they all belong, and not just names that sound like I'm in the UK or in parts of South Africa. And I think I'm always believing in that first step, and I think, you know, coming back in a year or two, hopefully I'll visually see Canada in the spaces and buildings in the most important spaces.
Well, that's great. We're delighted you were able to be with us, Ratna.
So after all that wisdom, I'll just make an observation that people in this country, and maybe other countries, and definitely in the city, seem to equate diversity with inclusion. And it is not.
Right.
You can be a very diverse society and not be inclusive. In fact, I think we know of places that are very diverse and deliberately exclusive. You can be a very prosperous society and not be inclusive.
Right.
To be inclusive and therefore to ensure belonging, it cannot be left up to aspirations or accidents. You actually have to be intentional about it. You have to have a plan, you have to have an action, you have to measure, you have to report out. And I think of the one thing this city, and I'll focus back on this city, what we could do here in this city, is to make sure that we have our own version of governance equity. We've had employment equity in this country, and if I think of all the laws that have lifted people from the margins to a slightly more central place, I would say it is employment equity. It has done a wonderful job for bringing people who historically were disadvantaged inside the tent. Not to the center of the tent, but definitely inside the tent. What we have not done is focus on governance equity. And that is something this city could do to advance the goal of belonging.
Well, and I hope not just this city, since we've got dozens and dozens of cities. So there's our challenge. We've got to think about how we do the small things and the big things, and we focus on governance. Would you join me in thanking Tanya, Ratna, Rashiq, and Maxim? Thank you. Thanks, guys.